Okay. So let's start from the behavioral interview questions. There are some common questions companies tend to ask, right? In every interview, you wanted to do self-introduction. So tell me about yourself. But I think everything you say in an interview, right, serve one purpose. Like, why should we hire you? Right. So even without people asking you in your answers, like you are trying to basically convince people that you are the right fit for this job, right? So I've seen, people starting, their self-introduction with they just talk too much about their history, but some of those are not really related to the job, right? So everything needs to be like tailored to this position, and why they should be hiring you. It's very important, right? We don't want to waste time, and sometimes people are just sitting there listening to what you say, and they don't want to interrupt you and let you keep going, but it's actually not very useful. Okay. And you also need to know when to pause, right? You have to sort of just read people and know when to stop, right? Okay. But when you do self-introduction, of course your background is important. But I think for most of us, it depends on how you position yourself when you go to an interview. I think for the students who have relevant experience, if you have worked on Beam data, then you should never call yourself like a career switcher or something like that. You are a data engineer. Okay, that's important. You are a data engineer. Otherwise, you'll confuse people. So you work for Beam, so you should say, hey, I'm currently working as a data engineer at a consulting company, Beam Data, right? And I have a Bachelor of Science, degree. I didn't originally come from data engineering, but I found it really interesting, and I invested a lot of time doing self-learning. I also graduated from a data engineering boot camp a while ago, and currently, I'm working on some client projects in data engineering for this company. Right? That's the first step. Like, just explain your background, but the information you're trying to convey here is, I am a data engineer. When you look at resume, you can tell that I don't come from a data engineering or computer science background, but I spend a lot of time on upskilling myself. And right now I work as a data engineer already, right? And I have some projects that I can tell you about today, right? You mentioned that you worked on projects. And then that's a very quick introduction. And then you need to tell people why you think you're the good fit, or why you should be hiring me, right? That's one approach, right? Now, if you position yourself as a career switcher, then you need to focus on like the kind of effort you've put in, right? Like you will tell people, I'm really interested in data engineering, but they're looking for, they want to hear like the proof. Like you said, you're interested in data engineering, you want to become a data engineer. Show me the proof. What have you done to become a data engineer? Right? Just showing that attitude, and the amount of effort you put in is very important, right? So, and some people may want to know, like, so why do you want to switch to data engineering, right? So you don't need to wait for them to ask you. You can just explain, like, just one sentence explain. And I think sometimes students will say, like, I think for data science, students say, I read this article and saying that data science is very promising field, and the whole, like, society is moving towards, AI and engineering. And that's why I decided to make a career switch. There's nothing wrong with doing career switch. Maybe your hiring manager was a career switcher. Most of the people, at some point, like a certain point in their career, they may want to change. So nothing bad about that. You don't have to feel like, sorry about that. Like, you don't want to hide that. It's just say that confidently. After I did some research, I realized that I really want to do something like this, and then focus on what you've done, right? in order to be here today, here are the efforts I have made. I did online courses. I graduated from a diploma program of data engineering, right? And then I worked on a ton of projects. And today I've actually I can actually share my screen to walk you through some of the end-to-end data engineering pipelines I've created, right? It's in my resume as well. So you sort of set the tone and just let them know that you have something that you can demo. I'm assuming that it's virtual meeting, then you can share your screen, right? You just like remind people, yeah, I brought my portfolio or I have my side projects on GitHub I can show you today. I have some, end-to-end architecture diagram, data pipeline diagram. I'd be happy to walk you through it, right? People will be interested. And when they, start to ask you, your experience related questions, then you can bring that up again. I worked on this side project and I actually have an architecture diagram on my GitHub. Do you want to take a look at it? I can walk you through what I did. It's important to show people visual, stuff, so you get their attention right away. And it's not a boring, sheet of paper with bullet points. And then right away they're actually looking at they start to scrutinize your architecture diagram, and then they will have all kinds of questions, right? It's designed by your instructors, who's very experienced, so it's definitely not going to be too shabby when you show it to people. So you should have the confidence, right? And then, but just be prepared to answer a lot of those questions, like why do you choose this tool? Why don't you use that tool? And we'll discuss that later, okay? How to answer this kind of questions. But it's important to tell people that you have some sort of preparation. That will be very helpful, okay? So again, if you already have some sort of Beam data experience, then you should tell people that you are a data engineer. Don't emphasize too much on career switching, right? And don't tell them that, yeah, don't don't say any of those, and just say I'm a data engineer. You can, and this is what I'm doing right now, okay? And if you think that your resume has a lot of, big gaps there, in terms of like your education background is not even engineering, then you can mention that. I don't come, 2 years ago, I don't come from data engineering background, but, I found this very interesting, decided to make a career switch. I did A and B and C, and now I'm working as a data engineer at Beam Data. And I worked on 2 projects, something like that, okay? So that's the self-intro part. To conclude, because they'll give you like 2-3 minutes to talk, to talk about yourself, right? To conclude, you should always say that, I found this job, right, particular job, very interesting, right? That's why I'm here today, and I would like to let you know that I'm actually a good fit for this job. Or yeah, say something like this. It doesn't have to be exactly the same, but tell people you're really interested in this job, okay? Any questions? Oh, any questions about self-introduction? Nope. Okay, straightforward. Why should we hire you? This is a question that companies, even if they don't ask you a direct question like this, they're looking for an answer, right, in the interview. So why should someone hire you? I think you need to put yourself in other people's shoes, in the interviewer's shoes, right? From their perspective, like what kind of people they're looking for, right? Why are they giving you an interview? Unfortunately, before you go to the interview, you probably don't know much about their motivation, right? The only thing you have is job description and a brief conversation with HR. So that's why I said last week that, when you talk to HR, try to ask as many questions as possible, like how big is the team and why is the team hiring this position? So HR may tell you it's a backfill, someone left, or they're growing their team, right? These are useful information. And if they're growing their team, and or you can even ask how many data engineers work on this team already. You know, if you're the first data engineer or you're the fifth data engineer, the expectation is very different. If you're the first data engineer, communication skill is very important. Like you need to talk to different stakeholders, right? But if you're the fifth, you're just like, they're just adding one more team members because they get busy, right? So, but anyways, why should someone hire you? And you need to understand what is the hiring manager looking for, right? So you need to read the job description really carefully, and then go to LinkedIn, find that company and, you know, or the hiring manager and see how many people work in that team, and look at their profiles. They usually give you a good sense like what they're looking for, right? And their team member skills is should give you some good idea. Okay. So you get that from job posting, right? And you also need to pick up the cues from conversation, I guess. This is kind of like a last minute thing. Like when usually the hiring manager will do introduction, they'll introduce the team, will tell you like about like, you know, sometimes they just tell you, right, why they hire someone, or they tell you about the team and culture. See if you can find something useful there, right? And it's important to know, right, what kind of hiring manager is this and what kind of team is this? Is this a new data team? Are you the first data engineer? Or is it an established team? I think you need to prepare different answers. If this is a brand new data team and the person interviewing you is probably going to be coming from the business side or the head of data or something like that in a small startup, right? They usually hire someone who's more seasoned, who's more senior, and they're hoping that this person can build up the team over time. Or the company hired a senior before, right? And the senior was like very hands-on doing all the implementation, but now they're thinking about growing the team. Okay. So if it's a new data team and you're kind of like the early employees, you know, in the data engineering team, I think you need to tell people that you can do research really well, right? You can communicate really well and manage stakeholders' expectations. These are not necessarily engineering skills. It's important because think about a new team. Let's say there's a new chief data officer, got hired into a startup. They don't have a data team in the past. The priority of the team is like, let's just, you know, they have a lot of databases already. They need to build the data platform. They probably want to leverage Amazon Web Services or Google Cloud. Now what? So they have to figure out, okay, so what are some of the data sources? We need to ingest all of these data, right? And that means they need to talk to different teams. They have to understand, you know, what the marketing team need and what kind of data, business activities that generate data. They want to talk to the dev team, IT, try to understand what are the backend systems they use, talk to sales, and basically have to talk to every single team and understand their data needs, right? So in that case, you know, as a data engineer, the first data engineer on the team, you need to be able to join those conversations. You also need to help the company do a lot of research on like what kind of tools you guys want to use. Because as I said, there could be 50 different tools doing the same thing. So you need to understand the constraints here. Like, is there a budget constraint? Right? Is how fast do they want the team to deliver the first data warehouse or the first, you know, dashboard? And then you need to decide, like, do we just go with a proprietary tool, you know, some kind of SaaS tool, like Fivetran, you know, or should we go with, you know, open source, right? But of course, it's going to take longer if you're going to use open source tool, and you have to set everything up and things like that. And also you need to do research on pricing probably, right? So I think, you know, if that's the scenario, you need to prepare the answers slightly different ways. Okay, but if it's an established team that like you're just joining as one of the data engineers, I think what they are looking for is pretty standard, right? You work well in a team, you're skilled, and you can learn really fast. That's it. Like they're definitely looking for someone who's easy to work with, right? And someone who's a team player and who can, like, when it comes to data engineering, the skills you have, like the companies might be onboarding a new tool, so you need to be able to learn really fast, right? And you're already skilled, so that's why they're giving you an interview. You should have the confidence because they think that you have the right tool, as the right skills, right? And that's probably how you should, you know, tackle this kind of questions, why they should be hiring you, right? And put yourself in the hiring manager's shoes, right? It's less about yourself. It's all about like how, like what is their, what is the hiring manager's challenge? To be honest, you need to sort of try to understand if it's possible before the hiring manager tells you. And you know, if it's a backfill, right? Someone just left, then you should tell them that you can learn and pick up things really quickly, right? And based on the job description, you need to tell them that you have some kind of specialized skills that you know, which is what they want, right? But as I said, if it's a new team, you should let them know that you're very reliable. And because if it's the head of data, he's actually going to spend the first 3 months just like talking to the business team and different vendors. He'll be very busy, but he's not going to be the person who's implementing all of these. You are going to be the person, right? So you probably need to tell people that.
You know, with that said, I wouldn't feel confident actually at this stage taking or being the first data engineer. I would prefer, having not worked in data engineering yet, to actually have a mentor to work under as opposed to being the first one.
Yeah,
And I take that just from, you know, past experience where I've jumped into positions where I was, you know, obviously not quite qualified for, and it just ended up backfiring on me.
Sent back by what? Sorry.
It backfired on me. Like,
Oh,
it
okay.
just, I was in over my head on past positions, you know, for like management positions and such forth. And so I just wouldn't make that mistake again.
Okay. Yeah, that's case by case, right? I mean, it also depends on, like, you know, when you're talking to the leader, basically. So you also need to tell, like, sometimes that leader is, you know, your manager is very technical. They can still, like, it depends on the managers as well, I think. You know, there are managers that they just expect you to be able to do everything. But there are also managers who are quite technical. They're willing to lead and also coach people. So I think during the interview, you should be able to tell what kind of manager that is. And just like be very straightforward with your questions, like at the end, because they will ask you questions, right? Do you have any questions for us? Yeah, but if it's not the right fit, then I agree. Like, you don't want to be stuck in that position, because people will have high hopes and high expectations. But to be honest, if it's the first data engineer job, they're probably looking for someone a bit more senior, or
Right.
the manager himself is very technical, and he's okay with hiring someone who's a bit junior. Yeah, so different scenarios.
Okay, makes sense.
Hey, Shava, one question on where you shared, like, you know, as data engineering or data architect, right? So just want to tell you my understanding of what, like, you know, both different roles is. Like, first, you get hired as a data engineer, and then after you gain some experience on the engineering side, then you become a data architect, where you build these pipelines, right? So that's the first question. The second question, like, what does architect actually do? As in, like, first, when a company, like, you know, they start building the data, like in a workflow or data pipeline, it's already built there. After that, it's the engineering team that manages, like, what happens to architect after that in that organization.
Yeah, give me 1 second. Let me find something. You know what, maybe I'll just do the whiteboarding. So yeah, first of all, data architect, yeah, so if you can start by working as a data engineer, and you know, in a couple of years you can transition into data architect. Data architects, or you know, solution architects, you know, for cloud, they are less like, you know, focused on the technical side, right? Because that's why they are the architect. So
Yep.
they, you know, in a typical bank, they usually, right, decide the blueprint, right? So let's say we have this really massive cloud migration project, then they will need to do a lot of research as well. They, you know, they need to help the company decide. They make a lot of decisions, right? They're very influential in decision making, like what kind of tools, platform are we going to use, and what kind of tools are we, what is the right tool for us to engineer this pipeline, or for us to build this data warehouse? What kind of tools should we use, right?
Okay.
That's what the data architect will, and they will make decisions, and people on the at the execution level, implementation level, will basically have to live with that. And that's why a lot of people don't like to work with data architect, because they will say, hey, you need to use this, right? And
Okay.
they have their reason, and of course they are looking at things holistically, but it doesn't mean like the team members will be happy using adopting the approach. But it is important for the company to have some sort of governance, right? Like with the help of an architect. I think it's important, but yeah, but they will become less technical. They definitely come from a technical background. So because if you haven't implemented anything in the past, it will be very hard to become to be even qualified for a data architect.
Okay. Just follow up question. What is the difference between data governance and data architecture?
It's different. So data governance is so you know, it's pretty broad topic, right? For example, data quality is part of the data governance, and security is the data governance, right? And yeah, and also it's not just the tool, it's the, you know, there's the people, but also there's the process. The governance is more the policies and process. For example, let's say in an organization, who should have access to a specific S3 bucket, right? So who can access what, right? So so the IAM stuff, right? So AWS is a platform that allows you to set up all of these users, roles, and policies, right? But the data governance is like, but how should we engineer this, right? Who should have access to some resources, right? Who should not have access to that? So that's part of the governance. They set the policies, right? And they're policy makers basically. And then the actual team will have to, like, you know, work, the governance team will need to work with IT, right, to actually create those policies, turn those policies into, like, you know, the IT infrastructures and all of those AWS rules and things like that, right? And data governance team also needs to know what is the data quality, like, you know, and then they will need to sort of govern, right, how we are going to, you know, throughout the ETL process, how are we going to clean up the data, right? What's the minimum requirement for data quality, for example? It's never going to be perfect, but you know, what's the requirement for that? Yeah, they do these. Yeah,
got it. It's completely different from data architect governance then.
It's very different. Data architect will are always going to be in those data governance conversations, right? But architect is more like decide. Now we have these high level governance and policies, right? We need to follow that. But for this particular project, right, cloud migration project, how should we do that? Which vendor do we work with? What tool are we using the AWS system, right? Because we have so many different database options. Which one should we use for what purpose, right? And how are we gonna? So, and also like what you did in the overall architect, like the end-to-end diagram, data architect might be involved in that as well. But
Okay.
of course, someone wanted to implement that data pipeline, that's data engineer,
Oh, okay.
right? In
Oh,
smaller organization, you're sort of just like architect and engineer at the same time, because you basically decide how you're going to engineer the pipeline. But in
mhm.
like only in big companies, they need data architect because there are just so many different teams want to access, for example, the same infrastructure, then they will have to make the best decision. And sometimes it might not be the best decision for one particular team who's more advanced, but they also need to take into consideration other teams, other users, consumers of your data infrastructure, right? So they have to
Okay.
keep that balance. Yeah. And vendor relationship is important. For example, data architect will tell you, no, we're not going to use Apache Airflow,
Mhm.
because and they will tell you reason ABC. They tell you, oh, there's some security issues, or a lot of times they already have relationship with IBM and some companies, right?
Oh, okay.
So they will say, okay, let's use this. So because they have to think about the existing vendor relationship they may have paid for the tool for 3 years. Like you have to use it, even though people are not happy about it. They want to use the most advanced tools. And that's why in the banks, you notice that there are maybe 1 or 2 teams that are building everything that's cutting edge, right? But majority of the backend ETL infrastructure team, they're using very old-fashioned tools. Like they're still on data stage. It's not that the architect don't want to move away from it, but it's like some of the data architect will spend a lot of times talking with the business, because when they talk to some business systems teams, they will say that, well, we can't get rid of this system. Like it's going to have impact A, B, and C. We're going to lose money, right? Then you sort of have to have a plan, say, okay, we're going to phase this out, but the plan is 3 years. So in the next 3 years, we're going to keep using this, but we're going to gradually migrating away from it. So they need to sort of work with the business closely. There are a lot of constraints and they have to make decisions, right? But when you actually set up the project team and say, okay, now let's work on this very specific migration project to migrate from SQL or SAS to Python, right? Then you need software people, data science, or data engineering people and project managers to make that happen, to do implementation, right? So data engineers are
Okay.
most of the time on at the execution level, right?
Okay. So like there's always like, there's no constant need of data architects in business, like, then they only come into picture when there's a migration or when they're building some data warehouse, right?
Yeah, they work at a more higher level for sure. Yeah.
Okay.
They're
Okay.
not even going to be involved in the day-to-day operations, like joining your stand-up meetings or your project meetings. Like they're in the picture when you need them. So they usually communicate at the senior manager director level, right?
Okay.
Yeah. So they're like the internal expert and consultant that you need to ask them, to help you make some decisions. And some companies will make have some kind of policies, like for you to work on a project, you have to talk to the data architect to make sure that it makes sense for the company, right?
Mhm.
Because you
Okay.
don't want each team to go out there and they have their own budget. And some teams say, okay, we're going to use Airbyte, and some teams say, okay, we're going to use Fivetran, and then it end up being a lot of tech debt, right?
Mhm.
Technology debt. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you.
Problem. All right. So and tell me about your experience. I think of course we need to explain to people the relevant experience you have. I think you can describe your current job if it's relevant, or the client projects you have worked on, and of course the side project you have worked on. So if you have worked on some sort of client project which is directly related to data engineering, don't jump into the technical details right away, because you're going to lose people. Just like the resume, like if you look at the resume and then you have like a couple of bullet points talk about Power BI, talking about data ingestion, Apache Spark, but let people understand like what's the goal or what's the pain point, like what problem are you trying to solve, right, in that project. That's very important, because if you tell people that I built this end-to-end pipeline, or you say I built a data warehouse for the client based on a modern data stack, right? You sort of paint this picture, and that person is experienced. He already know what you did. Oh, you did modern stack, you did a data warehouse, then you definitely did A, B, and C, because they have that experience. It's much easier for them to relate to that. But if you say, I use this tool, I use that tool, it confuses them. Like they still don't know what you did, right? So communicate the high, like, the high level information first, right? Tell them, for example, you can describe the client. If it's a Beam data experience, then I worked with, automotive, whatever auctioning company, right? Who's transitioning to a modern data stack and built everything on the, and then you can say that the client, has very, like a lot of legacy systems on SQL Server, but now they were trying to migrate to Microsoft Azure, and we have to build all the data warehouse in Azure. And I think that's enough, right? Let's describe the client and their pain point, right? And you can sort of describe, you can sort of describe the team as well. But just like mention it briefly, like I worked in a team of like 3-4 people, and at Beam Data side, and we have project manager, and we work directly with the client to help them deliver this project, right? And of course, you spend more time describing the project, but don't jump into like, oh, I used, let's say Azure Synapse to build the warehouse, or I used the DBT to sort of automate my SQL workflow. But still, you need to communicate at a higher level, sort of just summarize what the project is about, and also tell people which part did you work on. They will definitely ask you this question, because you said, okay, I built this end-to-end data warehouse, and people may ask you like, did you build everything yourself, right? Chances are not. So which role did you play, right? So yeah, this is how I would approach this. And also maybe you can focus on the impact, right? When it comes to data engineering, the impact is usually very quantifiable, right? Data engineering is usually helping the company reduce cost. See if you can find ways that I reduce the cost. The cost can be monetary, the cost can be time, right? So you reduce the cost because you optimize some sort of data warehouse SQL queries, right? Or you switched from some sort of databases to Amazon S3 to reduce the storage cost, right? Just try to think of even for your portfolio project, you need to think about like the impact. If this project were to be deployed for a real company, or the reason why you choose some sort of, a pipeline architecture is because it can help achieve cost reduction. For example, whenever you have something Lambda, you can mention that it's reducing cost, because right, because you don't have to use an EC2 instance anymore. So that's definitely cost reduction. Okay. Has your project improved some sort of speed and latency, right? So if you're switching to streaming, definitely lower latency, right? Or maybe it's making the data infrastructure or pipeline more scalable by adopting distributed computing, or maybe using Lambda, or using a data warehouse. But you're either reducing cost, right? Improving the speed, latency, make it more scalable. The migration to cloud is, I would consider that as an impact as well. It's a pretty big deal for many companies doing the migration. So you're sort of modernizing the data infrastructure, right? And it could be automation, because automation can save a lot of time as well. So so whenever you build data pipelines, right, using either cron job or Airflow, some sort of scheduler, or using Lambda, you're doing automation, right? So you should mention these a couple of times in your experience. Okay. Okay. So that's that's the client project. But for side project, I think it's similar. First of all, you need to explain to employers like, what is the motivation? Like, why do you even choose this project, right? And of course, I know there's a template given to you guys, but you still, I think you guys chose different data sets, right? Data sources. So try to explain why you collected the TTC or whatever bus data, right? Why, what is the motivation? Maybe the bus data itself is not that exciting, but like what was the problem you're trying to solve, or how potentially this project can be deployed to actually have real life, impact, right? So what is the motivation? Even if you've done that in a simulation environment, it is okay, but you should tell people like if this approach can be adopted by TTC or whatever, it's going to have pretty big impact, right? So explain the motivation, and before you jump into the specifics, right? Paint a high level blueprint. Like this is what I did, high level architecture. And that's why if you're going for an on-site interview, bring that diagram, print it out, okay? Or print out your project summary, put that in a binder and take it to the interview. Or if it's online, you can tell people like, is it possible for me to share my screen? I would love to explain that to you. I don't see why people should say no. Some people may, because they would like to do it, control the pace themselves, but most of the time it would work. So explain the architect, and then they may ask you to pause on that screen for quite a bit time, and then they will ask you all kinds of questions, and you've built the entire thing. So it's definitely going to help you more. Okay. And they may ask you tricky questions, you get stuck, but it's okay. You just tell them that I haven't thought about that, but it's an interesting suggestion, right? I would love to implement that in the future. No one knows everything. So the fact that you have this diagram, you implemented part of it is already very impressive, to be honest, because a lot of times when you join a data engineering team, you're just like doing there's always going to be repetition in your job, right? We've learned a lot of new skills, new tools, but to be honest, like, it depends on the job. Like if you go work for a startup, you might be doing everything yourself. That's exciting. You're growing a lot faster. But when you join a big company, it might be like you're just building airflow pipelines. You're writing a lot of DAGs, but that's it. You don't actually, do a lot of data analysis or data cleaning or writing, so you focus on the pipeline side of things, right? In about 6 months to 1 year, you're already thinking about moving on to a different job that allows you to work on Apache Spark more, right? So my point here is that no one knows everything, right? Show them the diagram. If they question you, totally fine. Just tell them that, they give you some inspiration, you're absolutely happy to improve that. Just always show that attitude, right? And some people get kind of nervous and say, I get stuck, I don't know the answer. Then, they feel like they're not going to get the job. I don't think about that on the interview. During the interview, just tell them, hey, this is actually a very interesting suggestion. I'd love to implement that after this, after today's call. I'll just keep improving on that. Just show that attitude, right? Because if you choose to focus on the side projects, that means you're telling them that you're a career switcher. So all you want to show them is that you're very eager to learn and you're truly interested in this, and that's why you're making the switch. Showing that will be, because they already give you the interview, so you already have an advantage. So don't worry about that. You're not good enough. Like if you're not good enough, they're not going to give you the interview, right? So during the interview, it's really just to impress them and tell them like even though you're not like a seasoned senior data engineer with 3 to 5 years of experience, but you seem to be like eager and you can learn everything, whatever you need to learn. Because when you work on real life data engineering problems, you're always going to learn new tools, because every client or company is different. And the way they make decision is also different. And so maybe the company doesn't like Fivetran and they doesn't like high touch. They will say, okay, we want to, build things from scratch. So let's research, Snowplow. And no one in the company has done Snowplow before. So you have to read documentation. You have to work with their Docker container in a sandbox environment. You have to build some sort of proof of concept. Everything is new. But I think you're just reusing what you've learned in the program or somewhere else in your in the past to just like, this is problem solving. right? As long as you have that attitude and you have the foundational skills, and you should be able to get the work done. So that's the most important thing. Like they want to hire someone who can get the work done, right? Yeah, and when compared to a very traditional team in a banking environment, I keep using banking industry as an example because we've done a ton of training for them, and I do realize that for them to make some change, it's very slow. And that's why they even have change management team just to help different teams to migrate to different technology stack. We worked with an insurance company that use SaaS for data analytics, right? Everyone wants to do Python. We did a ton of Python training for those companies. And 3 years later, they're still on SaaS when I talk to them. It's very hard for them to make a change. And sometimes they realize that it's just like the internal employees don't have that motivation unless their job is at some sort of like it's risky. They may lose their job, then they will start thinking about learning new things, right? But it's common. Like everyone, people are always like that. Myself, we always have like procrastination or uncertainty and things like that. But the fact that you guys are in the program learning new things, is really good. So you just want to show people that attitude. So definitely don't panic if you cannot answer some questions in an interview. Sometimes they may not expect you to know everything. They just want to know how much do you know actually. Maybe what they've seen is good enough for the job already. So you should show more confidence. Okay. And yeah. And for the side project, I think it's good that you guys worked on something end-to-end. I even seen some like dashboard using Superset. That's really helpful. So that shows people that you understand the overall, process, right? Because you working as a data engineer, you need to support data analytics, data science. So knowing visualization is also helpful, and you can help them set up, the infrastructure. Yeah, so that would be my recommendation for the side project experience. Okay. Yeah, and sometimes you may want to also mention that you know some tools. So what I mean by this is, sometimes the job asks for A and B, right? But based on your research, before you go to the interview, that they will need C in the future, right? For example, right now they're focusing on, let's say, data ingestion or building some sort of pipeline, but that in the future they may need DBT for the warehouse, whatever workflow automation, right? You can mention that, or the company right now is using Apache Spark and stuff like that, but they don't have like streaming. So you can suggest that in the future you can use lakehouse architecture, but don't let people think that you're too excited about all the new technology, because they may think that you're not going to be that excited about the current job they're offering you. But you should let them know that you also, have learned Lakehouse, you've done a project about that. So in case the company have some, need in the future to do migration, you are that right person. Okay. And sometimes you want to let people know that you actually know more than what the job is required. And just give them some hint, and some people may pick it up. Some people may not even realize it. So that's the experience part. Sometimes they'll ask you like, have you read any tech blogs and books? So just get prepared and pick one of your favorite, tech book or data engineering, whatever, white paper or blog post. You should at least read one and just be ready to tell people, right? Because this field is changing so fast. It's important to have that learning aptitude and just keep learning new things. And all of these will leave, good impression. Okay. So you need to also know some of the latest trends in tech. I think I mentioned that briefly, right? Things like modern data stack, lakehouse, right? Serverless. If you can mention one of these, it should be good enough, I think. Okay. let's continue. So we'll talk about the technical interview questions. I'll start from this one. Do you know some tools? Do you know A, B, and C? I think I said this many times. It is totally okay if you don't know some tool. But I think when you read the job description, like some of the key skills they're looking for, you definitely to be prepared, right? But if there are certain tools you don't know, you just need to, you know, prepare like how to say it when you don't know something. Okay. Or you can say like, I don't know it, but you know, I'm very willing to learn and can learn really fast, right? Or you can say something like, I don't know this tool, but I know something that's very similar and I have experience with it. You know, it's just like when people ask you, do you know GCP? You can tell them I'm certified in AWS. I've worked with many different tools in AWS, and and it will be great if you can tell them that, you know, you understand the like the similar tools in the AWS ecosystem. Like if it's Google BigQuery, then you know Snowflake and Redshift, for example, right? I think one thing you need to understand or answer very well is, and when you walk the employer through your portfolio project or whatever Beam data project, data engineering project, they may ask you like, why do you choose this tool? Because this is very common question in real life data engineering. Like you're always making this kind of decisions, right? Why do we choose one tool over another? Like for example, why do you use Apache Spark, or why didn't you use Apache Spark in your project? And if you don't, the reason for not using Apache Spark is definitely like, do you even have a need for Spark? Because sometimes Spark might be an overkill if your data is not very big. If you're not doing like a lot of massive data processing, then you may not need Apache Spark. Or sometimes you use Apache Spark because the company already has this infrastructure and most of the pipelines are built using, you know, Spark on Databricks. Then even processing small data using Spark may make sense because you don't want to use another tool like Pandas, you know, right? But of course, in Databricks, you can use Pandas as well. For databases, you know, you may get questions like, why do you choose, right, a certain database, like a relational database over a NoSQL database? Right? I think the decision between Redshift and Snowflake is pretty straightforward. Like if your company, you stick with Redshift, it's probably because the company just want to stick with AWS as a vendor. So they don't want to deal with more vendors, right? And or due to some legacy reasons. And Snowflake, most people would like to go with Snowflake, and it's cross different platforms, right? It's platform agnostic. So I think that's an easy choice. But things like, you know, if you have used Elasticsearch database, and also MongoDB or Cassandra, whatever database, you may want to be prepared to answer like, why do you choose Elasticsearch over Cassandra, right? I think you just need to do some Google search and you'll be able to understand the difference here. We didn't cover everything, right? But Elasticsearch, at least we know that it's a full text indexing, right, database, right? So it does full text search. So if you have you would like to build search engine such as Indeed for job search, it's definitely powered by Elasticsearch. Right? The way you need to understand the way it indexed the text data, for example, right? But if you're building, you know, a chat app and the messaging data, it's probably much better to be stored in DynamoDB and Cassandra, which is usually kind of similar, right? You're not going to use Elasticsearch because it's not as scalable as Cassandra when it comes to data ingestion. You know, Elasticsearch. Cassandra is more scalable, and so they're used for different purposes. Okay, but I think most of the time they may ask you like, why do you choose a relational database over a NoSQL database, right? So that's something you have to get prepared. Okay, for example, when it comes to automation, why do you use Airflow? Have you thought about using, let's say, AWS step function, right? Or sometimes you used cron job. Like they may ask you like, okay, have you thought about using other tools, right? It is okay to use cron job. So many companies are still using cron jobs, right? It's not the best, data engineering tool for scheduling. But Airflow, basically depends on cron as well. But it depends on how sophisticated your pipelines are. But also sometimes you just want something really quick, then you use cron job instead of like maintaining the Airflow infrastructure. But if your data pipeline is pretty complex, then Airflow may make sense. Running Airflow using the managed Airflow service in AWS is actually not cheap. So you may want to consider using, for example, step functions, right? Combined with, Lambda functions. That's something you may want to look into, but it's just another way of running your pipelines. But for large scale problems, Airflow is probably better because it's built for that purpose. But now there are more options, right? There's something called, is it called Prefect? It's also pretty popular. And DBT, the data build tool, it's mainly used for data warehouse, like in data warehouses. So it helps you sort of build your SQL pipelines, right? So I think DBT is definitely better than Airflow if you're mainly doing SQL related work. So yeah, you can read about it. I don't think you need to be expert in it, but if you would like to apply for analytics engineer job, I think it will be great if you know DBT, the stuff we talked about in the previous session. Okay, so there's so many things you can talk about here, like why do you choose one tool? So you can never be prepared for all of these questions. So I would suggest, right, you go back, because it's much more likely for them to ask you questions related to your portfolio project or whatever Beam data project. So go back to your project, right? Look at the diagram and see, well, I used certain tools. What's the alternative, right? What are some of the alternatives, and why did you make a decision on that tool? It doesn't have to be the best tool for the job, but you just need to give them the reasoning why you decided to use this at that point. Either for, if you want to save time, right? And you choose something simpler, it could be saving cost, or you did the entire thing on AWS and maybe you just want to save cost because it's just, it's not covered by the company, right, you work for. Okay. Databases. There will be a lot of database related questions because I think any data engineers will need to be very good with data modelings and databases, right? But whether it's relational or non-relational database. Most of the companies still use relational database, even Facebook, right? They invented, I believe Cassandra, and but they still run the largest MySQL database cluster in the world. So MySQL, PostgreSQL, these are all very important. Right? You may want to. So I think we covered some of these, right, in our lectures. So get prepared to answer questions like, what is the difference between a columnar-oriented database and a row-oriented database? So this is the difference between, let's say, MySQL and Redshift, for example. So Redshift, Snowflake, those are columnar database, right? So you need to understand the difference. And do you know some of the columnar databases, right? Entity relationship and data modeling. I would definitely look into that. Maybe go back to a lecture. I forgot how much we cover regarding the data modeling, but definitely, star schema, right, is something you need to look into. And when it comes to SQL, right, how do you debug a slow running, query? There are usually a couple of reasons, right? You should probably look at indexes, right? If the data is not well indexed, it might be slow, right? look into partitioning. But how to debug it? You may want to look into the query plans to see which part slows down the query. You will have access to query plans in any kind of SQL console, right? Snowflake, Redshift, they all have query planners, so you can look into that and try to understand like which part slows things down. But of course, you can you can optimize the how you join the tables, right? So I think you might want to spend some time on this to make sure that you can answer this question well. Because even when it comes to Apache Spark, they may want to ask you like, how do you optimize Spark jobs, right? In distributed system, indexing is not very popular, right? We're talking about relational database here, so you can look into indexing. But when it comes to Spark and Hadoop, you don't usually index data, but the way you partition data, right, matters, and the type of joins you choose, right? So just look into that. I think you need to do some homework to get prepared for some of these commonly asked interview questions. Okay, in relational database, there's this primary key, foreign key. You may want to look at the notes, and I think this is pretty straightforward. You can just Google and find the answer. And sharding, what's the difference between sharding and partitioning, right? This is a commonly asked questions as well. And also, sometimes people may ask you like, permissions and securities. It's probably not that common, but it's related to governance, right? Just so you know, some databases will have like row level security, right? But in AWS, you can use, IAM to control the governance, like who can access, each table, right? We can use tag-based access control. Lake formation is part of the AWS, right? But for example, if you have a database table and a bunch of people have access to that database, how to prevent someone from accessing reading from one table, right? Let's say your company hired a consulting team and you don't want them to access everything, right? And you would like to hide some of the logic, right? So in that case, you can use database views, right? So they're always just looking at the view that triggers a bunch of queries. You're not giving them the query directly. And then you can control access level at the view level, right? So the person will not be able to touch. For example, let's say you have customer SIN number, right? And passport number in your database in one of the tables. And the consultant just needs to access like name, email, right? Some of the other attributes from the customer table, but you don't want them to read the SIN numbers and passport number. So in that case, you can create a view, right? The view is going to only select, email and phone number and customer ID. So it's going to ignore, right, the SIN number column, for example, and then you only give them access to the views. Okay, and so that's at the column level, but at the row level, databases such as Postgres has row level security. So even in the same table, you can control which rows they can access, right? And this is important for companies or platforms that build, the multi-tenant applications, which means think about, let's say, Jira and Confluence, right? So Jira, a lot of companies use Jira for project management, right? So they probably have like, I don't know how many, 500,000 customers. But in Jira, it records the number of projects a company has, right? And each project, there will be like users of, members of those projects, and they create, issues, and they manage the project basically. So there's so many tables, right, related to that. Now, do we create a separate database for every user? Right? They'll have to think about this from a practical perspective. Like if you have a 500,000 company, do you like users? Do you have a 500,000 database and each company has a separate database? That cost is very high because most of the trial users, like they just try it, and or like WeCloudData has Jira. We barely use it now. We move to Notion, but we still keep it. But I haven't used it for 6 months. But if they are going to keep that database running for us, it's going to be quite expensive. So actually the way they do data model is that they everyone's in the same massive database. It's probably going to be a NoSQL database, which is more scalable, right? But you have this low row level security, right? And so you can have that's why it's called multi-tenant. You can have different users, they're accessing the same database and tables, but depending on the role, they can only access certain rows, right? They won't be able to access a different company's data, okay? Something like that at a high level, right? And of course, you can use AWS IAM, right? Identity and access management they have like, you can create IAM roles, policies, right? To manage access to certain database entities, but IAM is not going to allow you to control which table or which column or row someone can access. So it's a combination of these, right? Something nice to know, but probably not that commonly asked questions. Okay, so these are relational database related, and I think there might be a lot of questions about SQL, right? So query planners, window function. I don't have the details here, but some things you need to look into, right? How to look at a query plan and for optimization purpose. SQL window function is important, so I think you need to do some practice in case people, the employers ask you things like so for example, how do we calculate, let's say moving average, right? In SQL, right? And some of the functions such as, the rank function, right? And also dense rank, okay? Right? And lead and lag, right? Some of those, functions, I think you need to look into that. It may come up, during interviews, but it also depends on how heavily they use SQL. I think there might be data engineering shop that purely focus on, Apache Spark and Python. There are similar concepts in Python as well, but I think it's the teams that use SQL more that are more likely to ask you this kind of questions, because it's very common. Like whenever you build data warehouses, like you don't use very simple like joins and stuff. Like you're always going to use window functions and write a lot of nested queries. Okay. Yeah, there might be questions about how to optimize joins. So, look into the past recordings, or if you can find, or just Google. There are a ton of resources out there. Okay. And there's the Spark jobs, right? How do we optimize and tune Spark jobs? And these are very technical. I found that like they're not going to ask you like 10 very technical questions. In an interview, expect that most of the questions are going to be about the project you've done, and they'll ask further questions. And to introduce your experience. Oh, sorry.
Sorry to interrupt. Like, I have some questions on SQL, like technical questions, like because it's very broad when we start learning SQL and expecting like this is a question that will be asked during the interview, right? So is there like maybe a stop or like a hard stop, like this is enough, saying like temp tables or subqueries or what you mentioned here in the SQL? So something aligned like okay, this is enough, like for most of the interviews. And also regarding when it comes to like Python, do we need to grow towards the object-oriented programming or the functional programming is enough like during the interviews? So did you know like what's the current trend now?
This really depends on the companies. So I don't think there's any like trend in this. So
Okay.
companies, either give you like a lead code, but that's like before you even talk to the hiring manager, right?
Yeah.
Have to pass the technical challenge.
Yeah.
As I said, I think only the big tech companies will ask you to do lead code. Most of the companies out there, they'd rather you can do well in SQL interviews, coding challenges, and the basic Python ones. Like maybe they give you like a for loop, problem to solve. Like it's very basic. It's not necessarily always going to be data structures and algorithms, because you rarely use that. Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, but I mean, yeah, for SQL questions, I would say, so you mentioned like, so let's say Python, right? So SQL, optimization questions may come up, but maybe they only ask you one question, like, how do you optimize SQL queries? That's it. It's open, right? They would like to know if you have experience with it. So you just need to hit a few points, like, telling them the approach is more important. You can say, okay, then that means we may have like a kind of slow query, right? Then I would probably look at the query, look at the query itself first, look at the structure. Can I break it apart? Because, if you have very nested query, then you're leaving it to the SQL engine to optimize it, right? Then you definitely like you want to know which part slows things down. Then you tell them, I'm going to look at the query planner. One is looking at the query planner, and second is sometimes it's just like query planner is not giving enough information. Then you break this query down, like it's very complicated query. You break it apart into 3-4 queries and see which part slows you down, right? And once you figure out which part slows you down, then they can, how to optimize. But in general, right, improve, the joins, right? See if you can index the table to make it faster. But yeah, some of those. That's query optimization. I find that people tend to ask. And then there's like sometimes union versus union all, right? They just want to test your understanding of some of these concepts. And window function is quite common because they want to know if you have actually processed like some complex logic, right? So like calculating moving average, right? Using like rank, lead, lag. You need to definitely look into this. This is quite common as well. Yeah. But yeah, and join, nested query, yeah. And for Python,
sorry, can I just interrupt for a question about this SQL technical? So at least based on my experience, not experience, like past 6 months in the this course, to be honest, we do not use the SQL very often. We pretty much just treat it as a database, and we select the column from tables, and then we use Python, whatever it might be. Could be pandas, or for some project we use the PySpark. We use those language to actually process the data we select from the table. So what I mean is, we barely use SQL statement to do some data process. So if that's the case, then why do we even bother, polishing the SQL skill instead of just a Python script or PySpark script? You know what I mean? Like whatever the SQL statement can do, we can do it from Python. Then why do we even need to bother to know SQL?
Oh, okay, that's your question. So so I think, if you go into an interview and people start asking you SQL questions, and if you can tell them that, I'm more familiar with, Python and Spark, it's totally fine. But you just like, because in Python and Spark, right, there's this like, this is common, like you have, union, you need to union merge data, you need to join tables, because in pandas, you need to join, in Spark, you need to join as well. So I think the tool doesn't matter. If your company use Spark, then you use Spark. But you need to like be able to tell them that you understand these concepts, right? Like for example, because in Spark, you need to do you need to be able to implement moving average or rank and lead and lag as well. In pandas, it may not be called lead and lag. It's called, I think it's called shift, right? But like the concept is important. And in terms of whether you know, you said that we can do everything in Python. That's true. But I think, you know, Python is not that scalable, right? So that's why when Python hit the performance, bottleneck, you have to switch to, if you want to stick with Python, then just use Apache Spark. But using Spark means that you need a Databricks or you need some sort of EMR infrastructure, right? So Python is probably not the best data engineering tool. It's important, coding skill you need to have, but in real life, most of the data is in the database somewhere, or it's in a data lake. It's in the data lake, then you use Spark to analyze the data. If it's in the database, and you have to write some sort of SQL, because data can be indexed, or the database engine itself is definitely going to be more powerful, right? When you merge and join tables, and pandas is going to be quite slow. When it, so yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Cool. So we talked about SQL. In Python, I think I'd rather focus more on the basic data structure, right? Or data types, so dictionary, right, list, and set, and of course pandas, right? And definitely they're going to help you. If they question Python, you're definitely going to write some loops, right, and comprehensions. That's what you need to prepare for. And if the company want you to do LeetCode, then they're definitely going to ask you like data structure and algorithm related. I don't think we cover that in the course, but there are a ton of data structure, algorithm related, free resources online that you can look into. But as far as I know, most of the companies wouldn't really ask you this kind of questions. They'd rather just give you a small data set or a small data structure and ask you to, do some processing. So you might be end up writing some loops and stuff. Yeah.
Thanks.
In data engineering interviews, people tend to give you like take-home assignment as well. So then they will give you a data set, or they ask you to download a data set from somewhere, and you need to, sort of build a pipeline. And in Python, pandas, or maybe Apache Spark or writing SQL, it's all just part of the pipeline. Right?
Yeah. Because like about 8 months ago, I had an interview with an organization, and they gave me a take-home exercise.
Yeah.
Right? And it was just like moving a database to another. That was the exercise. And they gave me two choices. One is via Excel, and one I can use Python. I was more leaning towards Python because it was easy for me. I created a function, but I think once it was done, the interview was more keen on how they could have achieved it on SQL rather than Python.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm so I want to brush up more on SQL now.
Yeah, it's also common to see companies asking you to use whatever language you prefer. I've seen a couple of times they'll ask you like you can use Python or you can use Scala and SQL to solve the problem. And even database, they don't really limit you to a specific database. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. There are also questions, when it comes to Apache Spark, then getting familiar with Spark UI in Databricks, right? Doing some debugging, and to understand which part, caused the error. So being able to to read Spark UI is important. That usually gives you a lot of useful information, right? And when your job is slow, or it's usually because the way you partition the data, or the number of partitions you have in Spark. Generally speaking, if you increase the number of partitions, right, that means you get more parallelism. Like you have a data set, you cut it into 1,000 different small blocks, right, or partitions, then your job can run faster. But always but it doesn't mean the more partitions you have, you're always going to be, your program is always going to be faster, because you need to take into consideration the cluster resources, right? So if you only have one node that has 4 CPU cores and 16 gig of RAM, it doesn't make sense for you to have like 1,000 partitions. It's because you have 4 cores, it means it can process 4 partitions at a time. Then you need to go through this 250 times to process the 1,000 partitions. So that actually gives you a lot of overhead. Your job may actually be slowed down even further, right? So choosing the right number of partitions, but I know Spark has evolved over time, so it may actually, try its best to optimize the number of partitions, but a lot of times you still need to manually tune that if you know the data well, right? Sometimes you run out of memory in Spark. People may ask you I get an out of memory. How do you debug that, right? But running out of memory, typically means that the data partition, right, Spark executor is trying to process is bigger than what it can process. So it's running out of memory inside the container. So one way you can try is just to increase the number of partitions, which means each partition now becomes smaller, right? And then you're doing this in the hope that it won't go out of memory. But sometimes reducing the partition size, reducing the partition size or increasing the partition number may not always solve the out of memory issue. And then you have to look further to see what's causing the problem, right? And storage optimization. And sometimes your Spark job is, you notice that when you look at the Spark UI, you notice that a lot of time are spent on reading the data. So is there a way that we can optimize the data storage? And then Parquet is pretty standard format for Spark, right? Try to go with Parquet so the read performance can be better. And it does the push down optimization as well. So yeah, that's storage optimization, and also caching, right? They may ask you how many different ways you can cache data in Spark, right? You can cache the data entirely in Spark. That's the in-memory caching. But Spark caching is implemented on top of something called persist, right? So you can persist data on disk if you have some sort of temporary or intermediate, data set, right? And that takes a lot of time to create, and you can choose to persist that on disk instead of persist that in memory, right? Because you're not going to have enough space to hold the data in memory. Then just persist that on disk, right? Persisting that on disk means that, well, at least during this Spark job, the lifecycle of this Spark job, you don't have to rerun the previous steps to create this intermediate table, right? It's already persisted on disk. But if your job somehow died, then you have to rerun the whole thing again. It may take you another half an hour to create this intermediate table. But at least if you want to reuse this table, it will just read from the disk directly instead of running through the lineage again, right? So you may want to understand the data lineage concept in Spark a little bit better, right? And sometimes you have data skewness, like whenever you do group by, right? Group by is sending the data with it's map reduce, right? It's key value. So, let's say group by user ID. So that means all the records, right, with the same user ID is going to be sent to the same partition or whatever executor for aggregation, right? But some users will have more records. Some users will only have very little records. So in that case, that creates this, imbalance in your data. So some Spark executor might be super busy and it gets overwhelmed, but some of them might be actually, doesn't have a lot of workload. So in that case, how do we balance that? Now, Spark 3 tried to solve that problem, right? It does a lot of things automatically. I don't think we cover salting, right, in our class, but it might be worth looking into. It's just some kind of traditional technique people apply, but even just Google it, right, and try to understand what is salting. What does that mean? You don't really have to have the experience implementing that, because some of the new features may have already sort of automatically do that. But some engineers may want to ask you if you know this kind of techniques, right? So you never know. And I would also recommend maybe if you would like to find jobs that using Apache Spark, see if you can read the Spark, read some white paper. Did I mention? Yeah, so we have some Apache Spark stuff. So these are some of the original paper for Apache Spark. Every time they add a new component to Spark, I think they will publish some paper. Look into that. I think this is these two were the original paper, white paper, when Spark wasn't open sourced yet, right? It came out of UC Berkeley, and their CTO was the PhD there at that time, right? Mate. So it will give you, it's not like a machine learning or data science paper, so it doesn't have mathematics in it, so it's very easy to understand. Very good reading material. I recommend you look into that. If you want to understand Spark streaming, right, look into this paper. And Spark SQL, try to understand how Spark SQL works, and scaling, right, Apache Spark performance and usability. I think these come out of the folks who created Apache Spark, so use this as a really good reference before you go to an interview that you think will ask you Spark related questions. Okay. But yeah, so I don't think we have time to go through all of these in detail, but I just want to let you know that generally people are going to ask you database related questions, right? And when they look at your resume, they would like to ask you about the project you've done, and they will ask you why you choose some tools, right? And it's okay to tell them that you don't know some tools, right? And SQL, they may ask you SQL optimization related questions, and it's most likely going to be optimization, window function, and joins, the different types of joins. They're not going to ask very deep questions about join, but they may ask you different kinds of joins. Do you know this type of join, right? So it should be quite straightforward. Python, I don't think they will be asking you Python questions in a data engineer interview. Most likely this should be taken care of during the initial coding challenge phase, online quiz or whatever. Big data, Apache Spark, right? Look into Spark job optimization. That's pretty common questions they will ask, and read some useful white paper. And there's things about data pipelines, for example. Now, I think you have created data pipelines before in your project, so it shouldn't be a very hard question for you. So just tell people that there are different ways to build data pipelines, right? And you chose to use Apache Airflow, but also keep in mind that Airflow is not the only tool, right? There's AWS step function that you can try. There's the traditional cron jobs, right? You can write, bash scripts, but that's not suggested, of course. So Airflow is a better version for that, and it's built using Python. And some question came up in some interviews, people ask you how did you deploy your Airflow cluster? they ask you questions about the deployment. So they basically want to know, like, are you using a more scalable version, or are you choosing just using the very simple version of Airflow? But you've worked on the project, so I think you'll be prepared to answer this kind of questions. Okay. And automation, these are related, I guess. But whenever you talk about pipeline, keep it you should always let people know that you know how to use Lambda functions, right? Because you don't always need Airflow, because Airflow requires infrastructure setup, and it's known for not being easy, to set up Airflow infrastructure. So sometimes if you have some ad hoc needs, like using Lambda might be a lot easier, right? And then people may ask you, like, how do you deploy your Lambda function, right? Do you use the command line, right, with containers, or do you just log into the console and just write your Python script? And of course, you want to tell people you use a better way to, more advanced approach to deploy your Lambda functions, right? Using maybe the serverless, whatever tool. Okay. And when it comes to data engineering, like data storage is obviously very important as well. So I think Parquet is a really good, columnar data storage format, right? So I'm not sure if you're aware, right? On disk, right? Parquet is a columnar data store. It's very popular. But what about in memory? Like, what if your applications would like to share data in memory, and you want to do this using a columnar format, right? You can look into, there's a Python package called, Feather. It's just something to be aware of, right? Feather, and yeah, it's used quite commonly in the Python ecosystem, and also the R community. Okay. And data storage mechanism. So there's HDFS. Some companies may still ask you this, like, what is the Hadoop distributed file system, right? And Amazon S3. There's also Redshift, Snowflake. These are used for data storage as well, but they can do SQL, right? So when are you going to use HDFS? Then I would say it's only when the company has some sort of legacy system, or they have truly massive data. So Uber, they probably still use HDFS, but they also have Hadoop as a legacy system, right? You can use Amazon S3. But the difference between HDFS and S3 is that if you have a Hadoop cluster running on EMR, HDFS distribute the data directly on the cluster, right? So the data is actually stored on those EC2 instances running EMR. So whenever your Spark job wants to read data, it reads from the EMR cluster. So data read is going to be a little bit faster, right? And S3 is remote, right? So you can store data in S3, and whenever you need it, your EMR cluster is going to read or stream the data from S3 into your cluster, and it can process it. But HDFS sort of just persists the data on the cluster already, right? So you don't have to repeatedly read data from S3, because if you have another Spark job that runs the same data set, it's going to read from S3 again. So that part is expensive, no matter how you optimize that using Apache Parquet, right? But I think a lot of companies would just choose S3 and use EMR to read from that, because at least like Amazon doesn't charge you when you send data from S3 to EC2. It's free, right? So so at least it doesn't cost you money. Then it's probably easier to implement, because that means you can have a Spark cluster without Hadoop, because Hadoop still needs setup, right? You still need to set up Hadoop. Like, what if you're not using EMR, using Databricks? Then Databricks relies on S3. If you use AWS, right, then HDFS is out of the picture. The companies only are still using Hadoop are the big tech, like Facebook, Uber, they've been using Hadoop for so many years, so they're still using it, and they have truly massive amounts of data. So HDFS makes sense. Or the banks, or the insurance companies that deployed Hadoop clusters, a couple of years ago because Hadoop was very popular and everyone would like to do data lake. But then people didn't realize that it's going to evolve so fast. Now people are all moving to the cloud. Then you can just use Spark with S3, right? So Hadoop sort of becomes this legacy system, even though it's still very important. So you may end up doing Hadoop stuff. Like, for example, one of our TAs at TELUS, he is still using a lot of Hive, right? Kafka is great. He's still using Hive and Hadoop because telecom data is massive. The cost of doing everything in S3 might be very high. So HDFS still makes sense if they have a Hadoop cluster. And then they will have to use technologies such as Hive, right? But if you use Spark, then you probably don't need to use Hive. A good reason to still using Hive is Hive has this metadata database, right? So you can create all the databases and tables. You have schema. But if you use vanilla Spark, it doesn't have like a catalog. Then you always have to, like, when you create a data frame, you always need to create like the table structure yourself, right? Just like pandas. But of course, Spark can read from a data catalog, such as Glue, right? So it's not a big problem anymore. Okay, so that's data storage, and also, like, how do you structure your data on S3 in S3, right? My personal experience is that, for example, if your company has an application, it collects, let's say, different kind of event, right? So if you use a chat application, when you register an account, that's some sort of registration event. When you update your profile, that is an event, right? Each event has an event ID. So event ID 111 always mean that someone has updated their profile, for example. There might be an event ID 2, which is sending a message. Event ID 3, which is reading a message, right? So a typical application may have hundreds of events, right? These are events related to your application. So how do we store this data, right? In Amazon S3 or in HDFS, you need to figure out a way to structure this, right? And typically, in S3, right? And of course, you need to have the bucket, okay? And you group the folders by event ID. So you have event 1, 2, 3 all the way to 1000, right? There's a company that I used to work for. They have thousands of events. So you're looking at like thousands of tables. Each folder has all the events. And let's say the message read or message sent. Then there are a lot of it's pretty massive, right? So and then you bucket that by year, month, day, and even hour, right? Within that hour, in that S3 folder, then you can have zip files, right? It depends on how you ingest the data. If you use Kafka or use AWS, the Amazon Kinesis, then maybe every 5 minutes it's going to send a zip file, right, to this folder in S3. Okay, so in a typical hour, then you'll have 12 gzip file because it's 5 minutes per file, right? That's typically how your data is structured. And then you can partition the data. Like if you're using Hive, then you can partition the data based on these folder names. So when you do the where filter, like where you choose year 2022, day, let's say 11, right? Then it's going to just point to that folder, right? And then the read performance. So it's not reading everything basically, right? That's how we do that in a blob storage, but in the database, then you can probably create index and partition the data as well. So yeah, so that's how you structure the raw data, right? In S3. And then if you're building a data lake, you're doing data ingestion, right? So like sometimes, companies, if you ingest data, you have a landing zone, right? Landing zone is a place for you to keep, landing zone is a place for you to keep all the raw data, right? And you may actually want to process the data and also mask the data. Then you have the masking data folder as well. So you can keep the data that way. Like you have a raw folder to keep all the data, and you also have processed the data, right? It can be a different bucket as well. So yeah, so and then if you have landing zone, it has all the raw data. So you know that only certain people in IT will have access to the raw data, because the raw data is unprocessed. That has the most sensitive information. It absolutely need to be secured, right? You're not going to let a data analyst to be able to access this S3 bucket, right? That's not really, that's violating the policy for sure, right? So that's why, so you have the raw data. Only certain account can access it. And one account that can access that is your data engineering pipeline account. That can read the raw data, right? And let's say mask all the data that has sensitive information, right? And then you save that to a different folder. You put that into processed. That means this data has been masked, okay? And then that allows more people to be able to access this folder for whatever purpose, right? Yeah, so this is like tier-based access, but yeah, that's how you structure data in S3, okay? Okay, so these are technical questions, but at the end of the interview, hiring managers usually ask if you have question for them. You should definitely prepare some questions. The worst case is that you said you don't have any questions. It doesn't feel like you're that interested in the job, unless the session has been really interactive and you've asked all the questions along the way and had great discussion. Then they said, no, I think my questions pretty much got covered. So you don't have to, you don't have to ask questions. But in most of the cases, right, during an interview, they ask you questions. So now you have an opportunity to ask them questions. So you can Google and find many different, ways people ask hiring manager questions, right? But some of them that I found useful is that you can ask, the hiring, if it's one-on-one, you can ask the hiring manager, like, why the job excite you, or which part of the job excite you, right? And ask about the team, like what's the vision, what's the roadmap for the team. They'll try to tell you as much as they can, I guess. And ask them how they make decisions on tooling, because there's so many different tools. Are they more leaning towards open source tools, or how ask them how they make decisions, and that tells you sort of sometimes like if this is the right team for you to join, because if the team doesn't have any decision-making power on the tools they use, then it's probably decided by other teams, right, or data architect, or the company may have a culture that the data engineering team can use whatever they want, but they need to do all the research. Then that might be a more exciting team to join, because you will be able to join and choose the right tool, and they're more likely to use more advanced tools, and or tools that allow them, modern tools that can help them save money. I don't know. Ask about growth opportunity. What is the path like? If I were to work on your team, right? What is the growth opportunity, right? But definitely show enough interest, right, in the job to leave a good impression. I think we're at the end of this session. Any questions? The last one is just a design pattern related. But I think since we've worked on the end-to-end project, my whole point here is that let's imagine you're going to build a video transcribing service, right? And you need to understand, every time you think about a question, you always need to think about from an end-to-end perspective, like where does the data come from, right? So let's say the data come from, let's say after this session, this video recording is going to be saved to Zoom, right? We would like to automatically process this video today. So Zoom is the data source. So how do we get data from the Zoom API and push that to Amazon S3, right? When this 500 megabyte video MP4 got saved to S3, do we want to trigger a Lambda function to process this video right away, right? So you need to set up the S3 event trigger. And then it sends to a Lambda function, and that, assuming it's Python, then that Lambda function does something by calling an API, it processes the video, right? And after that, like, where do you save the data, right? Do you save the data back to S3? Do we also push that to Vimeo? Because we use Vimeo, and we need to get a Vimeo code, whatever ID that we need to put into the learning portal so you guys can see the recording, right? We very much would like to automate this process, right? And then when the data is pushed to the learning portal, I want the program manager to get a Slack notification, right? So you sort of also need to have a Slack notification, a function there, right? But what if then this is the basic setup, right? But then in some real life other applications, you may have a lot of videos you need to process, or a lot of PDFs you want to process. Then do you want to set up a queue, right? A job queue that you can use Amazon SQS, the simple queue service, right? To do the intake, right? And that sort of also help you, to do this in a more scalable way. So just try to follow this pattern, right? Where does the data come from, and where do we ingest the data into, and how do we process the data? And then after we process, where do we persist the data, or where do we store the data? And after that, is there any other triggers, right? Do we trigger Slack notification or something like that? And then as the basic setup, and think about how do we scale this if we have a lot of requests, right? Yeah. Any questions?
Is it okay to talk about, if you're talking SQL and Python, the fact that you've never actually used in production? Like, there's one thing to learn Python, SQL, and tools like Git, just by watching videos and testing them out, but not having used them in production, is that like a downside that we should avoid talking about?
You can, so things like Git, it is okay that you haven't worked with Git in production, but you do need to know how to work with the Git, right? For example, when you upload your portfolio project to GitHub, you need to basically work with Git. I think just watching online tutorial and try to implement your pipeline, let's say, because when you upload that to GitHub, you will be working with Git commands. So yeah, it's okay to not have production experience. It's totally fine. And to be very honest, a lot of data engineering teams, they don't even follow the best practices. For example, they don't have the CI/CD pipeline, but that's more advanced topics, right? So it's not a must-have. I think most of the data engineering, data engineers, they probably still don't use Git, to be honest. But it's definitely a best practice is still definitely need to use Git.